Okay, I think that we are all complete now, and I think that we can begin. My name is Christian Pereno, and I am a professor of history and theory of architecture, and also very interested in the relationship between boredom and our environment, architecture, and the places in which we live. So we have this session, which is an open session with four different papers that deal with different approaches and different, let's say, interests about how boredom relates to our everyday life. We're going to begin with Sierra Sheard. And Sierra Sheard is a graduate student in applied philosophy with a concentration in healthcare ethics at the University of Louisville. Her research focuses on Black existentialism, the racial dimensions of affective states, and the social determinants of health, particularly for Black individuals. She is also a graduate research assistant at the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research. Sierra.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can now.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. My name is Sierra, and I am a graduate student at the University of Louisville. And today I'm going to be presenting on a paper that I co-authored with Andreas Elpidoro that concerns racialized boredom and the racial and ethnic dimensions of affective states and the consequences of racial marginalization on affective states. So just beginning with a bit of historical context that isn't even quite that historical, as we are still seeing the effects of it today. But we're going to discuss the color line. And this was first utilized, this term, by Frederick Douglass in the North American Review and was reiterated by W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk, a very, very influential book of his. And in this book, W.E.B. Du Bois declared that the preeminent issue of the 20th century United States is the problem of the color line. And this, as I stated previously, was a sentiment that was also discussed by Douglass. And in these analyses of their experiences, as well as their observations of the experiences of other Black Americans and their social, economic, and political positions, this line really became palpable. This line wasn't just a literal line that existed in the aftermath of the abolition of chattel slavery. It wasn't just literal segregation, but it was also a line that transformed the entire existence of those who were marginalized and those in power as well. Um, and through its exclusionary and exploitative effects, the color line made itself visible and continues to make itself visible in almost all realms of life, from the school that someone can attend, from a neighborhood that someone can live within, from whether or not someone receives adequate health care. This really is just pervasive throughout every aspect of life in America for marginalized racial and ethnic groups. So a question that emerges is, with its nature, can the effects of the color line also be found within the realms of something such as our affective lives? And the answer is yes, of course. Exclusion, discrimination, marginalization, and exploitation undoubtedly alter one's emotional and affective experiences in profound manners. And boredom is, of course, a part of that. There are racial dimensions to the experience of boredom, which we will discuss in greater detail as we go along. I think a question that often emerges is when placed in relation to things such as exploitation, dispossession, discrimination, all of the things that those who are racially and ethnically marginalized face. Why boredom? Why are we discussing boredom? Does this not seem rather inconsequential? And this all derives from a common misconception of boredom, that it is just this trivial psychological phenomenon, that it's something that's experienced by the bourgeoisie or people who have excess leisure time. And this is a very, very common misconception, but a very harmful one as well. Boredom can be a very deeply unjust social experience, and it is not given the space that is needed to discuss it because of this misconception. Boredom matters. The frequent and chronic experience of boredom has been found to be strongly connected to one's well-being. It permeates to one's feelings of life satisfaction, the quality of their interpersonal relationships, and those who score higher on boredom proneness scales have been found to have greater experiences of depression and anxiety, and are predisposed to an increased risk of risky behaviors. So it's very, very important, and especially when it becomes racialized. And I know right now I am talking about the frequent and chronic experience of boredom, but this is not to dismiss um, state boredom and how important that is. We have obviously seen the research, and state boredom is thought to have a goal-directed motion, or at least perceived to have a goal-directed motion. And there are obviously great harms that come from when one cannot achieve that goal-directed motion and cannot achieve the cognitive engagement that they're seeking. And we see that a lot with people who are racial or ethnically marginalized. And there is a double disadvantage with respect to boredom for those who are racially and ethnically marginalized. Um, Racialized boredom, we propose, is rooted in unjust social institutions. And as I stated previously here, the goal-directed nature of boredom is inhibited. If if there's a signal being sent to you that the situation that you're in is not cognitively engaging, it's not fulfilling, and you cannot achieve that goal-directed nature of boredom, it's harmful. And two, the oppressive and systemic factors that lead to their marginalization can exacerbate the harmful concomitants and outcomes of boredom. So here, we have an already unjust phenomenon becoming even more unjust, as this can lead to further harm for those who are marginalized on the basis of race and or ethnicity. So moving on here, race can significantly affect one's experience of boredom. And I will say, while the psychological aspects of boredom have been explored in depth, and a lot of the social aspects have been explored as well, the research that is available on the relationship between boredom and race is a small but suggestive kind of body of research. So we had one study conducted by Watt and Vodanovich, and in that study, they found that Black individuals are more boredom prone than their white counterparts in this particular study. Another study was conducted by Alicia Chin in 2017. There were no differences detected within that particular study on the basis of race. But then another study conducted in post-apartheid South Africa did find that Black individuals in South Africa did have higher rates of leisure boredom, and this was thought to be connected to the residual effects of apartheid. Um, so we are seeing that there might be something here. And researchers have also begun to offer theoretical accounts on social aspects of boredom, these social relationships, mostly in the realm of socioeconomic status. So, in particular, Andreas Albaduro's interactionist model, which proposes three theoretical pathways for how these social factors, with regards to socioeconomic status, interact with boredom. And these pathways are one, that these social conditions affect the antecedents of boredom, and maybe boredom is experienced more frequently as a result of this. Two, that there are these social conditions that affect the experience of boredom, and that boredom is experienced differently by individuals with low socioeconomic status. And three, that maybe there's a transformation that happens. The individual's response to boredom is affected by their group membership. It's more difficult to alleviate this phenomenon because of this. Now, this can be applied to race, even though this is obviously talking about socioeconomic status. You can think about that in terms of another form of marginalization on the basis of race. And returning back to the slide, um, the severity of marginalization on account of one's race or ethnicity and the constraints that accompany it, similar to socioeconomic status, and as stated previously, often do not allow for movement between situations to easily occur. And again, this renders one unable to escape from this experience of boredom, and do not allow for it to easily be alleviated. So moving on, now that we have kind of talked about racialized boredom and this concept of boredom and race, this intersection, I want to kind of flesh this out and talk about what are the features of boredom um, that are amplified when they intersect with race. Where does this harm come from? And how can we place this in the context of race? So there are three features of racialized boredom that we discuss. And the first one is the presence of constraint. And there are two forms of constraint, obviously, physical and psychological. But in this section, I will be talking mostly about physical constraints. And I think one of the biggest forms of physical constraint in terms of race within the United States is redlining. And redlining essentially has been a historical practice of essentially housing segregation. Black people, largely in the United States, have been relegated to certain neighborhoods that are of lower quality, aren't taken care of as much, typically in areas that are food deserts where there isn't access to healthy or fresh foods. Often there isn't as much access to adequate healthcare. And typically, because of systemic factors, movement between places has been very, very difficult. So it's often Black people are placed in these neighborhoods, and movement outside of those neighborhoods is almost impossible because of systemic factors, often. There is also occupational segregation. So often Black people are relegated to jobs that aren't as high paying, jobs that often involve excess physical labor, jobs that do not have great working conditions. And again, similar to the housing situation that I discussed, often movement isn't possible because of these systemic factors. So now we see how there is this constraint, and with people not being able to move from situation to situation, and without them being able to kind of fulfill this goal-directed motion and alleviate themselves of their boredom that they're feeling because of where they live or what their job is. Um, this becomes a great harm. And there are compounded constraints for those who are multiply marginalized. I won't discuss those as in detail in this presentation, but it becomes even more compounded for Black women or for people who are Black and queer, identities that come with even more constraints within the United States and beyond. And here, this desire for cognitive engagement that is central to the alleviation of boredom, as one is seeking to obtain satisfactory cognitive engagement, cannot be realized. One cannot move from situation to situation. One cannot find a more engaging alternative. And as a result, we sometimes see an increase of maladaptive and harmful behaviors as people are trying to assuage their boredom and they don't have any other way to do it than engaging um, in harmful behaviors, which again becomes a further form of oppression. So then moving on to our second feature here, frustrated agency. As we've established previously, there are these unfavorable social conditions for people who are racially or ethnically marginalized. And in addition to these unfavorable conditions, people are constantly made aware of the opportunities for meaningful and satisfying cognitive engagement available to privileged groups, such as white people in America. And there's kind of this twofold thing that happens. One is made aware of how unengaging their situation is. And then they're also made aware of these opportunities for engagement that are offered to these other people. They see this and they see that this is inaccessible to them. As a result, we see this frustrated agency. These conditions lead to feelings of unfulfillment, perceptions of lack of meaning, and ultimately can be contributors to boredom. And on the subject of frustrated agency, um, when looking at agency, there has been discussion within the literature about how it is a feature of boredom, a feature of socioeconomic status. And so we can look at these two things and say that it can naturally be extended to race when looking at someone's social position. There is another form of constraint that also often emerges, which contributes to agency, and that's this idea of psychological constraint. Um, this has been discussed at length within the critical race theory literature, and also within a lot of different forms of literature, and how there is this constraint that occurs for those who are racially and ethnically marginalized. Perhaps the best example is the concept of double consciousness and how when someone is racially or ethnically marginalized, when they exist in the world, first they're existing in the world as someone who isn't white, and second, they're existing in the world in relation to whiteness. And so they're never really achieving this sense of agency. Um, And from this, there's this deprivation of self-regulation that we have spoken about and adversely influences one's behavioral responses, decision making, and careful thinking. Yeah. So then moving on to our third feature here, which is perceived meaninglessness and follows from the first two. Um, Meaninglessness, fatalism, and despair are often the outcomes of systemic exclusion, dispossession, and devaluation that occurs to racially marginalized and minoritized groups. There has been a lot of experimental and theoretical work conducted demonstrating that boredom is closely related to a perceived lack of meaning. It does vary there, on one hand, some people argue that this perceived lack of meaning is a distinctive characteristic of boredom itself. On the other hand, some have argued that this meaninglessness is an antecedent to boredom or a cause. Regardless, our theoretical approach to racialized boredom we propose is characterized by a perceived lack of meaning. And this perceived lack of meaning is socially induced and pervasive due to systemic oppression. And it stems from this felt dissatisfaction of how one is treated on account of their racial or ethnic identity. There has been previous work conducted on socioeconomic status and how socioeconomic status, those of low SES, they have a lower kind of feeling of meaning. They have this lack of meaning, and it's often stems from the exclusion from various social and cultural activities on account of their socioeconomic status. And while there hasn't been this work done on race up until this recently, we can extend this idea of social exclusion to race. And we can see that social exclusion is also found in the lives of racially marginalized groups and ethnically marginalized groups. We can see this in jobs, as spoken about previously, occupational segregation and not having the same opportunities as those who are in more privileged positions. Healthcare and being devalued as a knower within a setting, a healthcare setting, not having what you are conveying taken seriously, and also not having access to healthcare at all. The accumulation of wealth and exclusion from the attainment of that. Um, Segregated labor markets, and also just plain discrimination and being excluded from social settings on the grounds of that. And we see that this becomes compounded for those who are multiply marginalized. Black women in particular are often devalued as knowers, and this results in self-silencing much of the time, where eventually people just stop trying to convey that there is even anything wrong. This happens a lot in healthcare settings where Black women are consistently not taken seriously and consistently devalued. And we've seen in the literature that often, when this continues, when this is persistent, when people are placed in these social settings, they just don't engage, which has led to detrimental consequences. So then, in conclusion, marginalization on account of one's race and ethnicity often results in feelings of constraint, a crisis of agency, perceptions of meaninglessness, and a lack of satisfaction. It also begets racialized boredom, a socio-political effect that targets and potentially causes harm to disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups. Here, boredom is not trivial. It's not solely a matter of luxury or the result of having excess time. It's not solely a bourgeoisie phenomenon. The color line knows almost no bounds. These affective effects cannot be alleviated without radical social change, and they also cannot be alleviated until we start to take this seriously. That boredom is something, a deeply unjust social phenomenon, or can be.
Perhaps I can begin with something. Of course, as an architect, I'm very moved by this idea of the color line of the red line, which is, a spatial concept, very material, very, we can say it, evident as a kind of political boredom. And your observations, in a way, reminded me of an article, I'm not sure if you're aware, that is called The Architecture of Servitude and Boredom, which was written some years ago by a very conservative thinker called Russell Kirk. And of course, he makes this correlation between these marginalized boredom and the architecture in which these people are forced to live. Um, but also, very interestingly, he begins to suggest in a very kind of subtle way that that this inhabitation uh, is not just a symptom of oppression, but can also, you know, this marginalized boredom can also become a kind of way of resistance and awareness, in the way that you realize that you are bored, uh, you realize your condition, evident in this architecture, but at the same time you want to remain bored because boredom uh, is a withdrawal from the oppressive system. You don't want to be part of it. Therefore, you establish a critical difference, and then you say, I want to stay bored. So boredom becomes, on the one hand, yes, the symptom of oppression, but at the same time, potentially a form of resistance or awareness. So I'm not sure if you have seen it from this other potential side.
That's a very great point. Thank you for bringing that up, and I haven't read that piece. Um, would you be able to say a little bit more on how it could become a form of resistance? I I'm very curious, and I haven't heard that perspective before, but I think it's an interesting one.
Um, as perhaps as a teacher, um, as an academic, uh, the best example is when your students say, "I'm bored," but not because they find the material boring, but because they refuse to engage with the material. So it becomes a rebellious act against the authority. So boredom becomes a way of establishing a distance. It's a refusal to the offerings of the environment. And by doing that, you say, I don't want to be part of it. I don't want to be part of this, let's say, authority that is imposing me these conditions. So I remain bored. And in that boredom, I find some sort of, yes, awareness of my situation.
And that's quite fascinating. Um, I'm not completely sure how I feel about that, but I do think it's a very interesting approach, right? Um, I guess part of my concern in that approach is that you are having this awareness of your situation. Um, and I do think that that can be a very helpful thing, but I wonder how that is alleviating the potential harm. I don't know if just completely stepping away from the situation and stepping away from the social structures and just saying that, oh, I'm bored. I don't know if just that action. Um, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
it, I, I, I don't think that it's that, the act of resistance alleviates in this case in particular, but perhaps it's the moment before that,
Yes, yes.
moment of you realize that you are bored, and you realize why are you bored, and then you realize that you don't want to be part of the system, and then you say, I rather remain bored, but at the same time, then I try to find alternatives to the situation.
Okay, yes. I think that I misunderstood at first, so I apologize. I do think that that is it's very interesting, and I actually do have something that I want to add now. Um, there have been some groups of people throughout history where you can see this happening. And I do think that that is important. I think that coming to that realization and having this as a form of resistance and realizing your material conditions and how harmful they are, and saying, I'm going to kind of lean into this and try and establish something outside of these conditions, I do think that that is important. We can see this a lot with like the Black Panther Party, as well as like Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm, and these structures that exist outside of the oppressive social structures. obviously, it is hard because those same structures are still there, and I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to proceed with that, but I do think it's fascinating, and I do think that we can see this in some different pockets throughout history.
And I think that it is a fantastic question for architects, actually,
Yes, yes.
because the question is, yes, if this architecture, represents this kind of marginalized situation, then how can architects create a different way of inhabiting that is not an imposition of certain, structures? So,
Yes.
from an architectural point of view, I think that it's a fantastic provocation. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. I think art as a whole, particularly um, when you look at the art that's coming out of all of these marginalized groups of people right now, in resistance, that is kind of on the outskirts of like these major structures. I think it's a beautiful thing. Um, and I really appreciate that question. I'm going to be thinking about that all day now, I think.
Well, no, thank you for you prompting it.